7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
Portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here at DC's Museum of the Bible, removing all obscurity and open for all to see.
For 70 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls kept a secret nobody could read. Then somebody finally asked the right question. Not what do these scrolls say, but what are they made of? In a lab at Tel Aviv University, Oded Rechavi pulled ancient DNA out of the dust on a single fragment, ran the sequence, and froze. Because the animal whose skin became that scroll could not have been alive anywhere near the cave it was found in, not for a year, not for a day. And what that one impossible result quietly proved is going to change everything you thought you knew.
This is a sample of one of the big scrolls. We have 5 of them, really well preserved.
The shepherd and the cave. To understand why that one result matters, you have to go back to the moment the scrolls entered the modern world. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Tib threw a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea and heard something shatter inside. He climbed in. He found ancient clay jars stuffed with leather scrolls wrapped carefully in linen. He had no idea what he was holding. Nobody did.
He was looking for a lost goat when he came to the entrance to a cave. He decided to throw a stone into the cave to see if he could flush out the goat.
This is a sample of one of the big scrolls. We have 5 of them, really well preserved. Those scrolls turned out to be the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. The oldest known biblical manuscripts in existence, dating back over 2,000 years. Between 1947 and 1956, roughly 25,000 fragments representing about 1,000 manuscripts were discovered in 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran. They contain the oldest known copies of biblical books, Genesis, Isaiah, Psalms, alongside sectarian writings, community rules, hymns, and apocalyptic prophecies. They spanned roughly 250 BCE to 68 CE, the most turbulent period in the history of both Judaism and early Christianity. Sealed in clay jars in the dry Judean desert, the scrolls had outlasted everything around them: the temple in Jerusalem, the Roman Empire, every civilization that rose and fell over 20 centuries. But when scholars finally unrolled them, the scrolls didn't just offer ancient texts. They raised questions that would take 70 years to begin answering. Where did they come from? Who wrote them? Why were they hidden? For 7 decades, the smartest people in the world thought they had the answer. They were wrong. The theory that ruled for decades. Scholars from universities and seminaries around the world analyzed every visible feature of the scrolls. They examined handwriting styles. They studied the parchment color, texture, thickness, trying to match pieces from the same animal. They analyzed language, theology, calendar systems, and literary style. These are the earliest copies of the Bible that we have. They are older than anything that we had previously. The dominant theory pointed to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes. Ancient historians like Josephus and Pliny the Elder described the Essenes as a monastic community living in isolation in the Judean desert, practicing strict purity laws, copying sacred texts, and waiting for divine judgment to descend on a corrupt world. The settlement at Qumran, just a short distance from the caves, looked like exactly the kind of community Josephus described. The theory held together. The sectarian writings described a tight-knit religious community with its own hierarchy, its own rules, and its own theological calendar based on the sun rather than the moon. A direct challenge to the Jerusalem priesthood. The apocalyptic texts expressed intense hostility toward the temple establishment. The famous War Scroll, describing a final cosmic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, sounded exactly like the kind of text a separatist sect would produce. The conclusion seemed clear. The Essenes lived at Qumran, copied their sacred texts there, and when the Roman army swept through during the Jewish revolt in 68 CE, they hid their library in the nearby caves. For decades, this was the accepted story, taught in seminaries, featured in museum exhibitions and documentary films. The Dead Sea Scrolls were the Essene library. Case closed. Stay with me, because this is where it falls apart. Everything you just heard, the Essenes, the monastery, the 70-year consensus, is about to get dismantled by something nobody in 1947 could have imagined. Not a new scroll, not a new cave, a lunch conversation in 2012, and a single piece of cowhide that should not exist. Hit subscribe right now, because once you see how this came undone, you can't unsee it. The cracks in the theory. Even as the ascend theory dominated scholarship, uncomfortable questions kept surfacing. Questions traditional methods could not resolve. The scrolls showed extraordinary textual diversity. Different versions of the same biblical books, texts in different scripts by different hands. Parchment quality varied wildly. Fine prepared skins next to rough materials that looked almost amateur. Radiocarbon dating, applied to select fragments starting in the early 1990s, revealed that some scrolls predated the Qumran settlement itself. The numbers didn't fit. And then there was the question nobody could answer. Why would a single isolated sect possess multiple conflicting versions of their own sacred texts? Why would they keep two versions of the book of Jeremiah, one significantly longer, with entire sections missing and chapters in a completely different order, for a community defined by strict religious discipline? It made no sense. Some scholars proposed alternatives. Maybe Qumran wasn't a monastery. Maybe a pottery factory, a winter villa, a military fortress. Maybe the caves were a sacred storage space where Jews from many communities brought worn-out texts that couldn't be destroyed. These theories existed, but lacked the hard evidence to dislodge a dominant paradigm. Then something completely unexpected entered the story. Not from an archaeologist, not from a theologian. From a geneticist eating lunch. The lunch that changed everything. In 2012, over lunch at Tel Aviv University, a molecular biologist named Oded Rechavi sat down with a biblical scholar named Noam Mizrahi. They fell into conversation about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the challenge of matching thousands of tiny fragments, the frustration of questions 70 years of scholarship had failed to answer. Mizrahi laid out the problem. 25,000 fragments, no titles, no page numbers, no definitive way to match pieces to manuscripts. Scholars were working from handwriting comparisons and educated guesses about parchment appearance. Methods that were subjective, imprecise, and prone to catastrophic error. The stakes were enormous. The tools were inadequate. Rechavi listened. Then he asked a question. What are the scrolls made of? Parchment, Mizrahi said. Animal skin. Rechavi paused. Then the parchment has DNA. That single sentence cracked open an entirely new field of research. Rechavi was a geneticist who specialized in ancient DNA analysis, a technique that had already revolutionized archaeology by revealing human migration patterns and population history. He immediately understood that nobody had ever tried to apply it to manuscripts. Tell us that it's a cowhide. Okay. So, we have two fragments that turned out to be cowhide. Together with Penina Shore, the curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Rechavi and Mizrahi began forming the team that would spend the next several years attempting something nobody had ever done. What they were about to find would shake her too. Reading DNA without a touch. Here is the first problem. The Dead Sea Scrolls are sacred texts revered by multiple religious traditions and irreplaceable by definition. Any technique requiring cuts, drills, or sample removal was forbidden. The scrolls had to remain intact. How do you read the genetics of something you are not allowed to touch? The answer came from the containers themselves. Over decades of careful study, tiny particles of parchment had accumulated as dust in the boxes where scroll fragments were stored. That dust contained collagen, the structural protein of animal skin. Embedded within that collagen, across 2,000 years, was ancient DNA. By collecting this dust from blank margins and damaged edges where no text existed, the team could gather enough material for analysis without ever touching a written portion of the scrolls. The answer had been sitting in the dust all along. But extracting usable genetic sequences from that dust was a nightmare. The parchment process, soaking, scraping, stretching, drying, damages DNA at the molecular level. Iron-based inks are chemically corrosive. The scrolls. then spent 2,000 years in desert caves, handled by hundreds of researchers over 70 years, each potentially leaving traces of modern DNA on the surface. The team worked in specialized ancient DNA laboratories under conditions that looked more like a clean room than a library: full protective suits, positive air pressure, ultraviolet sterilization. They developed strict authentication protocols to prove their sequences came from ancient animals and not modern hands, looking for specific patterns of molecular damage that only accumulate over centuries, running multiple extractions, comparing results across laboratories. It took years, hundreds of samples, multiple failures. Eventually, they had reliable genetic sequences from dozens of Dead Sea Scroll fragments. And when Rachavi looked at what those sequences revealed, he reached for his phone. The cow that broke the theory. Most fragments came back exactly as expected: sheepskin. Sheep were common throughout ancient Judea. Sheepskin was the standard parchment material. Sheep could survive the desert environment around Qumran, but some fragments came back as cowhide. Noam Mizrahi stared at those results. He knew Qumran. He had spent years with these texts, with the landscape, with the history. He sat with the data for a long moment before saying anything. Because cow parchment at Qumran was not just unusual, it was physically impossible. Qumran sits in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea, one of the harshest, most arid environments on the planet. Sheep and goats survive there because they are adapted to desert conditions. Little water, tough plants in arid terrain. Cows cannot. Cows need abundant water, dozens of gallons per animal per day. They need substantial grazing land with real grass. There was no way a community living at Qumran could have raised cattle. Cow parchment cannot be produced in the Judean desert. Any scroll written on cowhide came from somewhere else. The theory was wrong, not partially wrong. Wrong in a way a cow makes undeniable. When the cow result came across her desk at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Penina Shore stopped. She had spent her career as the curator and custodian of these fragments. She knew the dust on those boxes better than most people know their own homes. She read the result twice. She told her colleagues this was the moment she understood everything was about to change. Not just the academic debate about the Essenes, the entire framework for understanding what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are. She said it felt like the room had tilted, and the cow parchment wasn't random. It was attached to specific texts, specific versions of specific books, which is where the DNA gets stranger. Fingerprints in the parchment. Here's what they could do now that nobody could do before. By analyzing genetic relationships between different parchment samples, researchers could tell whether multiple fragments came from the same individual animal. Two pieces of parchment made from the same sheep share essentially identical mitochondrial DNA. Two pieces from different sheep don't. For 70 years, matching fragments had been guesswork. Now they had genetics. They had fingerprints. Stay with me, because this is where it gets serious. Take the book of Jeremiah. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve two dramatically different versions of it. One looks like the Hebrew Bible familiar today, longer, with chapters in the standard order. The other is significantly shorter, missing entire passages, chapters in a completely different sequence. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, our best Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament books dated to about 1000 AD. Scholars had argued for decades over what that meant. Was it an early draft, a theological edit, a scribal error? The DNA gave a definitive answer. Fragments of the shorter Jeremiah were written on cow parchment. Fragments of the longer Jeremiah were written on sheep parchment. They came from different animals, almost certainly from different geographic regions. They were not varying copies of the same tradition. They were two distinct textual traditions, developed separately, in separate communities, in different parts of ancient Judea. That is two completely different versions of Jeremiah preserved by two completely different communities who had never agreed on what the book of Jeremiah should say. Read that sentence again. Two communities, two Bibles. The team also examined the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, a liturgical text describing angelic worship in the heavenly temple. Copies were found at Qumran and at Masada, the fortress where Jewish rebels made their last stand against Rome in 73 CE. The DNA showed multiple Qumran fragments came from completely different animals. The text was popular, widely copied, independently produced, not the property of one sect. Then came the kinship analysis. By examining nuclear DNA markers, researchers could sometimes determine that parchments came from animals that were genetically related, siblings, cousins, members of the same flock. Clusters of related animals pointed toward a specific production center, where multiple scrolls were made from locally sourced animals at roughly the same time. And here is what showed up next. Some clusters of genetically related parchments, clearly produced together in one location, were mixed in with completely unrelated parchments from totally different sources. Different animals, different flocks. No genetic connection whatsoever. The collection had not grown organically from one scriptorium. It had been assembled from multiple origins, representing multiple communities across multiple decades, possibly centuries. The library theory didn't just crack, it collapsed. A world of many voices. Here is what that means. If the scrolls came from one isolated sect at Qumran, their extraordinary diversity was almost inexplicable. Why would one community preserve multiple conflicting versions of sacred texts? Why would they maintain copies representing theological positions they opposed? But if the collection came from multiple communities across ancient Judea, brought together into the caves over decades and one final catastrophic crisis, everything makes sense. The diversity isn't a problem. It's the whole point. The DNA evidence supported a theory some scholars had proposed but could never prove. The same caves where Muhammad Edhdhib's rock broke that clay jar in 1947 had functioned as a geniza, a sacred storage place where Jews from various communities deposited worn-out or theologically sensitive texts. In Jewish law, any document containing the divine name cannot simply be discarded. It must be stored with reverence. Ancient communities maintained designated storage spaces called genizot for exactly this purpose. Now, picture this. Jerusalem is only about 20 miles from Qumran. When the Roman army besieged the city between 68 and 70 CE, Jews fleeing the catastrophe may have carried sacred texts into the desert, adding them to materials communities had been depositing at the caves for generations. Family scrolls, synagogue scrolls, texts a dying world was trying to save. The caves near Qumran weren't a monastery's private archive. They were a sacred library belonging to all of Israel. The cow parchment fragments proved something more specific. Texts were physically moving between regions. Someone had carried scrolls written on cowhide from wetter, more fertile areas north or west of the desert into the Judean wilderness. This wasn't a closed community looking inward. It was a connected network of Jewish communities exchanging texts, ideas, and religious life. Here is what that means for the origins of Christianity. The world Jesus lived in was not a world of theological uniformity. It was a world of vigorous, geographically diverse religious debate. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't belong to one faction in that debate. They captured the whole argument, a Bible still being written. For scholars of Scripture, the implications cut deeper. There was no single authoritative text of Jeremiah that everyone accepted. There were multiple versions, shorter, longer, differently arranged, each preserved in different communities as their received form of the sacred text. For Genesis, for Psalms, for the books of the prophets, the process of canonization was still ongoing, still contested, still unresolved. This was no longer just theoretical. The DNA proved it physically. Different communities and different geographic locations were independently maintaining different versions of the Bible. The textual tradition was not fixed. It was alive, and it was different in different places. The environment in which Jesus lived and taught, in which the early Christian movement took shape, was immersed in exactly this diversity. Competing visions of Scripture, competing understandings of law, competing hopes for what God would do next. And the evidence had been sitting in dust on a shelf the whole time. Questions no one could ask. The 2020 publication of the DNA study opened an entirely new era in Dead Sea Scrolls research. Perhaps more remarkable than what it answered was what it made possible to ask for the first time. Before this work, Scholars could not determine with scientific certainty whether two fragments came from the same manuscript, whether a text was produced in one location or many, or whether specific scrolls shared any physical connection beyond subject matter. Now they can. Can researchers identify specific production centers for different texts? Can they map the geographic network of Jewish scribal communities? Can they track how textual traditions moved through ancient Judea over decades and centuries? Researchers are already pursuing these questions, analyzing DNA from a much larger sample of fragments, combining genetic data with multispectral imaging that recovers text invisible to the naked eye, building databases of ancient animal DNA from across the Near East. The goal is a geographic reference map precise enough to tell researchers, from a single scroll fragment, roughly where in the ancient world the animal lived whose skin carried that text. The work of reading the Dead Sea Scrolls is not finished. It has just begun. The story, written in the skin, the DNA study, represents something larger than the resolution of one archaeological debate. For 70 years, brilliant scholars studied these texts with every tool available. They deciphered ancient scripts, translated obscure dialects, reconstructed damaged manuscripts. Their work was real and irreplaceable, but there were questions they could not answer. Handwriting analysis is subjective. Parchment comparison is imprecise. Textual criticism can identify patterns, but cannot always determine whether those patterns reflect one community or many. Molecular biology provided a different lens. By reading genetic information preserved in the very material the sacred texts were written on, scientists answered questions that had seemed permanently out of reach. What that evidence revealed was larger than what scholars had hoped. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not the theological statement of one radical sect hiding from Rome in the desert. They are the accumulated sacred literature of ancient Israel, diverse, contested, richly human in their variety and contradictions. Multiple voices, multiple communities, multiple versions of the Bible, each one carried by someone into a cave in the Judean desert when the world they knew was ending. We only discovered this because scientists learned to read the story, written not in the ink on the surface, but in the DNA of the animals whose skins carried that ink across 2,000 years of silence. In 1947, a shepherd's rock broke a clay jar and let the ancient world speak again. In 2020, Oded Richavi sequenced DNA from ancient dust. The shepherd opened the door. The geneticist heard what the door had been waiting to say. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where a single conversation over lunch leads to the rewriting of history, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell because we are just getting started.